Okay, I'm going to talk about diversity, and I'm going to try to lay out a concept to you that is fairly complicated to understand, but I'm going to do the best I can. And I've provided this example before, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to make analogies between biodiversity and cultural diversity. And in a sense, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how biodiversity, the patterns of biodiversity that we see in nature, apply to cultural diversity as well. And this might be hard to fathom at first. You might think that they are two different things, but let's think about this. So again, I'm going to provide an example of how nature diversifies itself and why nature diversifies itself. So if we imagine there's no life on the planet, eventually, well, something happens. I don't know if it's a god, I don't know if it's just evolution, who knows? But something happens, and there is the birth of the first single-celled organism. And what that single-celled organism does is it gets energy from sunlight. So it feeds on photosynthesis, perhaps. It feeds on sunlight. So soon enough, this single-celled organism, it replicates. And now there's two, and then it replicates again. And then there's 4, 8, 16, etc., right? And as this single-celled organism replicates, eventually there are so many of this single-celled organism that what we basically see is we get a top layer of this single-celled organism that is so dense that the layer beneath it can no longer physically get sunlight, right? So basically the top layer, there are so many of this single-celled organism that the top layer blocks the sunlight out from the bottom layer. What's going to happen? Well, the bottom layer is going to die, right? So that bottom layer, which it perhaps survived for a little bit, it's enough to replicate, but as the top layer replicated, some of those single-celled organisms got pushed down right below that top layer. Again, that bottom layer can't get sunlight, it can't get energy, it dies, right? So if the middle layer, now imagine a middle layer between those two, if that middle layer wants to avoid the fate of the bottom layer, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to evolve to feed on the bottom layer. It's going to evolve to feed on the dead organic matter of the bottom layer. And at this point, you have two distinct organisms. You have two different organisms because you have one organism that can feed on sunlight and only sunlight, that's the top layer, and then you have another organism that can feed on both sunlight and dead organic matter. Now, what happens? Well, eventually, that middle layer eats all of the bottom layer. And, well, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to run out of energy. It's going to have to evolve in order to survive. It's going to evolve to feed directly on the top layer. And in doing so, we now have three distinct organisms. We have the top layer, we have the middle layer that is only good at feeding on dead organic matter and sunlight, and now you have a third organism that can feed on live organic matter, dead organic matter, and sunlight. So you can see how quickly nature diversifies itself in this situation. It diversifies itself because it is designed to basically collect energy. And if it can't collect energy, it's going to die. In order to avoid death, it's going to evolve to transform energy in a different manner. So if we think back to the original layer, the original single-celled microorganism, what really happened is that single-celled microorganism became so dominant that something evolved. It became such a dominant energy source in itself, in its own right, that something evolved to feed on it, right? So this is where I'm going to kind of flip this analogy over to cultural diversity. Now, if we imagine that there is a culture that is so dominant that it is, well, it's basically hogging all of the resources, what's going to happen? Oh, sorry about that. So logically, what's going to happen here is the that that culture, that dominant culture, has such a store of energy that there's going to be a predator that evolves to feed on it. Okay, and what this looks like is immigration, right? So you'll have immigrants coming into the U.S. who are perhaps, well, they're competing with the United States culture. And the reason this is happening is because the United States culture has become so dominant. So you may not see the patterns of this analogy yet. You may not believe this is a valid analogy, but I promise you it is. And if you look for these patterns, you will see them everywhere. Nature diversifies itself at every step, okay? And again, if we go back to the single-celled organism example, if you fast forward 2 billion years from there, basically there have been so many predators that evolved to feed on dominant species, dominant organisms, that you now have, you have bugs, you have insects, again, you have plants, you have microbes of all sorts, you have you have monkeys swinging from the branches, right? You have mammals, reptiles, amphibians. You have all of this diversity of life that has basically evolved at every step. Basically, there's been a new organism that have evolved to feed on some dominant life form. So if we look at herbivores, the reason herbivores evolved is because there was so much plant energy stored in plant life. So what happens? Well, there's going to be a creature that evolves to feed on that energy. The same thing applies to culture. If a single culture is so dominant that it is basically hoarding resources from other life forms around it, nature is going to create a creature or something, or a culture that evolves to feed on that energy store, right, of that dominant culture. So it's if I were to explain another concept here, I'm going to explain the concept of symbiosis. So in a forest, you have monkeys, right? And you have trees. They're living alongside each other. The trees, they grow fruit, and that fruit effectively serves as the reproductive organ of the tree, right? So when that fruit falls off the tree, it goes into the ground, the seeds, go into the ground, and the seeds grow more trees, right? Now, the monkey, in this process, eats the fruit. The monkey then poops out the fruit somewhere with some other bacteria in that poop, right? And what happens? Well, it basically fertilizes that next tree. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the tree and the monkey. The tree creates fruit that the monkey can use for energy, and the monkey rather turns around and helps the growth of the next tree. So it's these symbiotic relationships that we also have to understand, because if we were to become a dominant culture or a dominant species, and in that process we eliminated all of our symbiotic relationships with the nature around us, then nature would have basically a motive to throw us out. Now, if we talk about culture, for example, if the United States culture became so individualistic and so, we could even say greedy, that it began to hoard so many resources beyond its need, nature would evolve to get rid of this culture, this individualistic culture. And again, as I said, the way that happens is through immigration. You have other, perhaps less individualistic cultures that move in, more symbiotic cultures that move in, and they replace that individualistic culture. So this pattern is there's basically an overarching pattern here that can basically be defined as symbiosis. And those cultures, those organisms which become too dominant and in effect reject symbiosis, nature is going to throw them out no matter what. So for example, if you start eating overly processed food, and what does that mean? Well, you strip all the micronutrients out of that food. Now you are deficient in micronutrients. You are, in effect, you are straying away from nature. You're straying away from the symbiosis that you had with the nature around you. In the past, humans would eat the food that grew out of the ground, or the animals that lived in nature, and they would probably shit right next to a tree. Now, what do? Well, we shit in a toilet. Who knows where that shit goes? Goes to some sewage plant. And in effect, we're not returning that organic matter back to the planet. And we're also not eating the food that grows out of the planet. So at every step here, to one extent or another, the United States individualistic culture is rejecting nature. And this is bad for us, because nature is going to win. Nature is going to evolve to throw out the species or the cultures which are basically in a state of anti-symbiosis, like they're behaving in an anti-symbiotic manner. This is just how evolution works. So how might that happen? Well, maybe it's chronic disease. Because we were eating all this processed food and we're not returning our micronutrients back to the planet, well, maybe a plague comes along, or a flu, or COVID, for example, and it kills us, right? It kills us because we were not obeying that symbiotic relationship with nature. If you disobey that symbiotic relationship, nature will throw you out. For example, if you hide in drywall enclosures all day, if you sanitize all the surfaces you touch, you wash your hands with that antibacterial soap, you bleach everything, right? When you do this, what happens is you are basically destroying your symbiotic relationship with the world that you live in. That's why the person who hides in the filtered air conditioned like rooms all day, that's why they go out into the national park and the pollen destroys their immune system. Their immune system isn't prepared for it. That's why when a person who's been eating processed food for the last 10 years, that's why when they eat a salad, it destroys their gut. It's because they are not living symbiotically with the nature around them. So look for this pattern everywhere you can. This pattern of diversity and symbiosis. And if you happen to be rejecting the symbiosis that you have with nature, and you're rejecting diversity, you're killing yourself. And it's harsh to say it that way, but that's the truth. If you are straying away from the nature around you, if breathing in pollen destroys you for 3 days and gives you all those allergies, if eating food that grows out of the ground destroys your gut, it is because you have destroyed the symbiotic relationship with yourself and nature. And in all likelihood, it's going to mean you're going to get sick. You're going to be more susceptible to the plagues and the flus that go around. You're going to be more susceptible to basically the next predator that evolves to kill you. On the other hand, if you live in nature, if you get dirty, you go walk in that dirt without your shoes on, if you go plant the foods in your backyard and eat the locally grown food, you're going to be healthy. Nature will protect you if you basically protect it. If you obey that symbiotic relationship with nature, it's going to take care of you. If you reject it, you're going to find yourself falling victim to depression, anxiety, chronic disease like heart disease or diabetes. The bottom line is that you cannot reject nature. And if you are somebody who is steadfast, you're holding on to your culture, and you're rejecting immigration and cultural diversity, you're going to be defeated. There's no way to beat this the diversifying nature of reality. It is the nature of evolution. Now, you could call it a god. Sure, go ahead, that's fine. But you have to understand that the way that God programmed the reality you live in is through this diversifying nature. So I encourage you to try to think about this analogy I've made between biodiversity and cultural diversity, because you may not think, again, you may not think this is a valid analogy, but the closer you look, the more patterns you will see between these two things. The dominant cultures in the world will, there will be another culture that evolves to take them down. And eventually, perhaps that new culture becomes too dominant and something else evolves to take it out. The trick here is to evolve with that culture, with that evolving culture. It is to adapt. If you don't adapt, if you don't accept the changes that are occurring, well, you're going to be killed by the next predator that comes along. And again, predator is kind of a, it's not a literal predator necessarily. It might just be immigrants who are challenging your tradition. And if you don't understand how these metaphorical analogies work in this reality, you're going to miss out on what's happening in the world today. The reason the world's going, the United States in particular, is seemingly so chaotic is because we are eating processed junk food, we are denying the new cultures, and in effect, we're creating division between us. There's a lot of people who like to say that division is, or rather that diversity leads to more division. That's not true at all. Diversity is not equal to division. A lack of acceptance of diversity leads to division. So when that new culture comes along and you're unwilling to accept it, yeah, it's going to create division. When that processed food comes along and you decide to eat it instead of the locally grown foods that are grown in that organic, healthy soil, when you reject that, you're going to become divided from nature. Okay, so this will kill you. It will kill you. There's no way to avoid it. If you're living an individualistic lifestyle that rapes the planet of biodiversity, the planet's going to win, and it's going to take you out. Again, whether a chronic disease or some other method. You can't ignore these patterns, because otherwise you're going to come and bite you in the ass. Okay, so there's that old quote, as above, so below. What that quote insinuates is that if, for example, if the soil microbiome is dying and you are eating the food that grows out of that soil, your microbiome is dying. And that's not good for your health. That's how that leads to leaky gut, leads to inflammation, and inflammation is being increasingly linked to all of our chronic disease epidemics, heart disease, diabetes, etc. You have to accept the new cultures. You have to accept biodiversity and diversity of culture. And when you do that, well, you're going to thrive. Nature's going to take you in and basically give you a big hug, because you are living, again, you're obeying that symbiotic relationship with all of the life forms around you. If you're again pillaging the land of all of the biodiversity, you're basically saying that humans are going to beat the 3 billion years of evolution of nature on this planet. It's just not going to happen. We will lose, or at least the people who reject that biodiversity and that symbiotic relationship will lose. They will be thrown out. So, what can you do? Obviously, you can eat healthier. You can accept that cultural diversity. You can look for the similarities with your cultural opposition and focus less on the differences. And that will enable you to address the problems we have in the world. It will enable you to work together across those cultural divides to solve the soil, the dead soil problem we have. It'll enable you to encourage other people to accept cultural diversity. What's happening in the U.S. right now is our individualistic, greedy culture has basically led us to collect excess resources and kill the planet in the process. And, well, that's why the depression's going up. That's why the anxiety's going up. It's because we're not living with nature. We are trying to we're trying to beat nature, and it's just not going to work. We will lose this battle 100 times out of 100, 1,000,000 times out of 1,000,000. It just doesn't matter. There's no species that can live without the nature it evolves in. You're not going to just rise above that nature. So you best take care of it. Take care of your planet. Take care of your fellow citizens, and you will you'll feel better. You will be healthier, and you'll be happier as a result. If you believe that diversity is equal to division, what you're really saying is that you're not accepting the diversity, and therefore you're allowing your lack of acceptance of that diversity to bring more division between humans and between the nature around you, right? So just give it a little thought. Thanks for watching.